Great song. Lord of heaven and earth, God of wonders beyond our galaxy. But is that really true? That's our topic for today. We sing the songs, sometimes we take them for granted, but is that really true? Is there a great God of wonders, the Lord of heaven and earth? That's our topic for today. This morning we're starting a 4-part series on common spiritual questions that people ask. And our question today is about the existence of God. Why are Christians so sure that God even exists? I looked it up on the internet this week. The most recent poll I could find was 2013. But according to a Harris poll, 2013, the vast majority of Americans still believe in the existence of some kind of God. 74%, according to that particular poll. But that number is actually down from the number 5 years earlier. 5 years earlier, it was 82%. So the trend does seem to be downward. Fewer Americans do believe in the existence of God. There's a growing number who would classify themselves as agnostics, they're not sure, or as atheists who are sure that there is no God. Agnostics and atheists are still the minority, but their number and their influence does seem to be increasing. I imagine, I don't know this for sure, but I imagine most of you know somebody who doubts the existence of God. I don't know, maybe some of you have doubts yourself. That's the reason for this series. I know it's a complex issue. I don't pretend to answer all those questions completely and perfectly in one session, but we are going to at least touch on the subject, touch on the question. All right, why are you so sure that God exists? This is just an introduction, but I hope it points us in the right direction. To prepare for this particular message, I've read and reread several Bible passages, of course. I also read what some Christian writers have said on the subject. And I also decided to read what one prominent atheist said. I've read this book this week. God is Not Great. How Religion Poisons Everything by Christopher Hitchens. About 10 years ago, a very prominent atheist who's now passed away, actually. I don't say all that to claim that I'm an expert on the subject, but I did at least try to be fair. I did at least try to read the book. Very angry man, by the way. And I guess I have one other qualification I can brag about. I once talked to Madalyn Murray O'Hair on the telephone. Remember Madalyn Murray O'Hair? She was the most prominent atheist way back in the 60s and beyond. She was the one who filed a lawsuit that eventually led to the ending of prayer and Bible reading in public schools. I had to talk to her. It was in the early 90s, back when I was an editor for Moody Magazine. Had to confirm some detail in a story I don't even remember, but I had to call her up, and she actually answered the phone and talked to me. She was civil, but let's just say very blunt. She could be a very intimidating person, I think. Well, here's my goal for today. I want to explain why believing in God can be a reasonable faith. Why believing in God can be a reasonable faith. I'm not claiming to give absolute proof. I don't think there is any absolute proof. Actually, I don't think there's absolute proof on most of the important things in life. But there certainly is not absolute proof about the existence of God. But we can have a faith that is reasonable. There's enough evidence to make it reasonable. Some people think that faith means just turning off your brain and wishing for the best. That's not the kind of faith I want. I don't want that kind of faith. But then other people go to the opposite direction, the opposite extreme. They refuse to believe, and I would use the term refuse very intentionally. They refuse to believe until they have absolute proof. They want it to be, absolutely clear, sort of like a mathematical equation or a chemistry experiment. They want it to be 100% provable, visible, measurable, quantifiable. That's what they're looking for. It doesn't work that way. Faith doesn't work that way. Faith in God is more like love than math or chemistry. How do you know that you found true love? Do you wait for absolute proof? Probably not. But you can evaluate some evidence. You can figure out if it's reasonable enough. At least I hope you evaluate the evidence and you didn't just run off to Vegas and do something overnight. I hope you evaluate the evidence before you make a commitment. You evaluate things like, are the two of us really good for each other? Are we compatible? Do we have similar goals? Can we communicate freely? That's the kind of evidence that people evaluate. There's no absolute proof of true love, but you can make your commitment based on some reasonable evidence. The same principle holds true for faith. Evaluate the evidence, think it through, then make a reasonable commitment. But don't wait for absolute proof. There is no absolute proof on matters like that. No absolute proof for love, no absolute proof for faith. Look for a reasonable commitment. So we're going to cover 4 lines of evidence today. 4 lines of evidence. If you want to take notes, the headings are in the bulletin insert. The first line of evidence is nature. You probably guessed we'd start there with having seen that video that we just saw, the music video. But one way to evaluate whether God really exists is to think carefully about nature, what we see around us, the physical universe. Too many of us, of course, just take it for granted. We just sort of rush through and we don't really notice the things that we see. By the way, a little parenthetical note. I think, personal theory, one reason why atheism and agnosticism are increasing is because as our society becomes more and more technologically oriented, we don't spend as much time in nature. We don't think about that as much. Personal theory. But anyway, we should ponder nature. That's the first line of evidence. First line of evidence. As one example, consider the sun. Now, I've mentioned this before. Those of you who usually attend might remember some of this. But that's one key element of nature that we ought to think about. Just one example, just think about the sun. Think about the distance. You can look this up on the internet for yourself, various science sites. But the sun is approximately 93 million miles from Earth, so far that it actually takes light 8 minutes to travel from the surface of the sun to the Earth. That says something about the distance. Or thinking about the size of the sun. Apparently it is 1 million times the size of Earth. You can't even get your head around that. 1 million planets the size of Earth could fit inside the sun. Or think about the heat of the sun. Scientists can do some measurement and then they have to do some mathematical equations to estimate. But they say the surface of the sun is 27,000 degrees Fahrenheit. 27,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the center, the core of the sun, they estimate to be, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, 27 million degrees at the core. That's hot. And then the speed of the sun, incredibly fast. We don't think about that. We sort of think of the sun as stationary because from our perspective, it looks like it just travels slowly through the air. But according to the mathematical calculations of astronomers, the sun is actually traveling around the center of the Milky Way at 500,000 miles an hour. That's how fast it's going. And of course, it's not going alone. The Earth is out here and it's rotating on its axis and it's spinning around the sun and all the other planets in the solar system, and that whole thing is speeding around the core of the Milky Way at 500,000 miles an hour. Now, do you think it's possible, just possible, that some force outside the universe made all that? Do you think it's possible to believe, reasonable to believe, that maybe there is a God who made all that? I think that's completely reasonable. Completely reasonable. If you don't believe in a God of some sort who made all that, you have to believe that the universe created itself somehow. Those are really the only 2 options. Either something outside the universe made it or something inside the universe created itself. So that's one line of evidence from nature, the sun. Or take for another example, the cell, just the single cell. Some of you have studied biology. You would understand this much better than I do, but the cell is incredibly complex, incredibly complex. I spent a little time this week looking at diagrams on the internet. It was all over my head, I confess. Nearly all of it was over my head. I can't begin to comprehend it. But you go away looking at those diagrams, impressed with the incredible beauty and complexity of even a single cell. There's like a little factory in there, folks. It really is. How the little proteins are moving around on what looks like chains or gears. It's just an amazing process. You ought to look it up sometime. Some authors use the phrase irreducible complexity to describe the cell. Irreducible complexity. And by that they mean there are so many different components that have to work at the same time and in the right way for that cell to even live. It's not just a single piece or 2 or 3 pieces. There are multiple components, depending on the specific cell, that have to work. They have to be functioning properly in the right way or the cell dies. So think that through. If some of those pieces aren't there, the whole thing doesn't work. So is it reasonable to suggest that some divine being is responsible for the design of the cell? Obviously, I think so. Now, I realize that the standard evolutionary theory sees no need for God in the process, but why not? Do you really believe that a cell with all those components could emerge by itself in the right order, in the right time, so that cell would actually continue to live? Or how did they develop and work all those different components? How did this cell work out the way to multiply before it died off? It has to work all that together so it would actually multiply before it dies off. How could cells develop the ability to specialize and to group together so that they could combine more complex organisms? The standard answer is random mutation over time. That doesn't sound very reasonable to me. It really doesn't. I can see how, theoretically, how random mutation could explain some things in a cell, but not the total thing, not the whole, full complexity of a cell. It's just too complicated for that. Here's another issue in nature. What about the beauty of nature? Have you ever asked, why is it so beautiful? Why is it so beautiful? Why is so much of nature so incredibly beautiful? If the universe developed by itself over time, if life developed by itself over time, why was beauty necessary? Why was beauty necessary? Why is there so much beauty in the universe? Why are we so attracted to that beauty? Why do we find the colors of a sunset fascinating? Why do we find the sound of music so compelling? You can't really explain those things by survival. It's really not necessary. I would call it unnecessary beauty. There's just so much of the universe that is beautiful and doesn't need to be. Some of that beauty you can explain is necessary for survival, theoretically. You know, you can have so much of nature that is so beautiful that has no survival reason. And so many things that are even beyond our view. Creatures at the bottom of the sea or in the most remote parts of the desert. Why are they so beautiful and fascinating? Why is our brain wired to appreciate that kind of harmony and symmetry and diversity? Why is that? A random mutation over time, maybe you can explain some of that, but it sure can't explain it all. To me, the beauty of nature suggests something beyond impersonal forces of physics and chemistry. It implies a being of beauty who created us to enjoy beauty. So I think in some ways the beauty of nature is maybe the most compelling argument in nature for the existence of God. There's a lot more we can say about nature, a lot more, but let's move on to the second line of evidence, the Bible. Now I realize a lot of people don't accept the Bible as the written revelation of God. We're going to talk about some of those reservations in a couple of weeks. But whether you accept the Bible or not, I do want to show you what some of the Bible says about God. So let's begin at the beginning. The very first sentence of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. If you have a Bible with you, it'll be on page 1. It's not too hard to find. Most Bibles have a table of contents and maybe some translation notes in the beginning, but you'll find page 1 eventually. And I imagine most of you have heard these words before. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Just 10 words. First 10 words of the Bible. But when you think about it, they make some very important claims about God. If God really is the creator of the universe, then at least these three things must be true. At least three things. A, God must have existed before the origin of the universe. If he was there to make the universe, he had to exist before the universe. The theological term for that is eternal. That's one implication. B, God must be distinct from the universe. He's not a part of the universe or dependent on the universe for his existence the way that we are. He can live inside the universe, he can work inside the universe, but he's not connected to it in the same sense that we are. He's not part of it. He's separate, he's distinct. The theological term for that is transcendent. He's transcendent. C, God must have power and authority over the universe. If he made the universe, then obviously he has the right to make plans for the universe. Obviously he has the right to make orders or give instructions for the universe, set rules for the universe. The universe and everything in it, including us, exists for his purposes. He's in charge. The theological term for that is sovereign. I wanted to emphasize those 3 points because if there is a God, it's important, it's vitally important to believe in him as he really is, not just as you would like him to be. You have to believe in him as he really is, not just as you'd like him to be. There are a lot of people today who have this soft and fuzzy view about God. They like to think about the love of God and the compassion of God, period. That's where they stop. The Bible starts out very differently. It starts out by declaring God to be eternal and transcendent and sovereign. Now let's turn to a passage in the New Testament. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Maybe a little harder to find. If you want to use one of the Bibles in the pew rack, you'll find it on page 1192. 1192. Hebrews 11, verse 6. Hebrews 11, verse 6. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So this verse makes 2 other claims about God. D, God is a personal being. Did you notice the verse refers to God as he? That's a personal pronoun. He. We must believe that he exists, not just that it exists. God is not just a force or a principle, it's a he. Now that doesn't mean that he's a male in a physical sense. He doesn't have a physical body, but he is a personal being, so we refer to him as he, not it. He has all the attributes of personhood. He has the ability to think. He has the ability to feel. He has the ability to make decisions. He is a person in the fullest sense of the word. He's a person in a fuller sense of the word than we are. He's a personal being. So that's D. E, God is a relational being. Hebrews 11 says it is possible to draw near to him. It is possible to draw near to him. And he will respond to those who seek him. He will reward them who seek him. So even though God is invisible, even though he is vastly superior to us, even though we can't understand him fully, it is possible to have a relationship with him. He is a personal being who is also a relational being. Now obviously there's a lot more we can say about God, about the nature of God as described in the Bible. But I think we're going to stop there for today. Nowhere does the Bible try to prove the existence of God. Nowhere does the Bible try to prove the existence of God. I think that's interesting. The Bible just assumes that God exists. In fact, it assumes that we should know that God exists. There are a couple Psalms that say it is foolish to claim that there is no God. Only a fool would claim that there is no God. In another passage, Romans 1 says that God's eternal power and nature are clearly evident in nature. God's eternal power and character is very visible, clearly evident in nature. Now let's consider a third line of evidence, the evidence of Jesus Christ. When Jesus Christ was here on earth, he claimed to be God in human flesh. He claimed to be a living, breathing manifestation of God himself. So obviously if those claims from Jesus are correct, there is a God, because Jesus himself claimed to be that God. He claimed to be the living, breathing manifestation of God. Now again, I realize many people don't believe those claims from Jesus, but I do want to point them out so that you can evaluate them for yourself. We get some evidence from God, for God in nature. We get more evidence in the Bible, more specific evidence, but we get the most specific evidence of all in the person of Jesus Christ. That's where you get the most specific evidence of all. When Jesus was just a boy, 12 years old, maybe you remember this story, he got separated from his parents. He was missing from his parents for a while. They were worried about him. They found him in the temple discussing theology with the religious teachers. And even then, Jesus had an awareness of his true identity. Even then, at that young age, he claimed a special relationship to God the Father. When he talked to his earthly parents, he said, "Didn't you know that I would be about my Father's business?" Meaning God. So even at 12 years old, he was claiming to have a unique relationship and a unique focus on God the Father. Later, when Jesus began his public ministry, he made some outlandish claims. And I say that reverently, but they are outlandish claims. If anybody else said those claims, we would lock them up. Jesus claimed to have the power of God. That's one claim. He said, it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons. He said, I'm casting out these demons with the finger of God. Just one finger of God's power. That's all I need. Likewise, he claimed to speak the words of God. He said, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. John 7, verse 16. Jesus claimed to have seen God. He claimed to have come from God. John 6:46, John 8:42. Jesus claimed that he deserved the same honor of God, and the same honor as God. That's a shocking claim, really. John 5:23. Everyone should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Jesus claimed that he was one with God. I and the Father am one. I and the Father are one. John 10, verse 30. In fact, Jesus even used the special Old Testament name for God, I am. He even used that and applied it to himself. John 8:48, before Abraham was, I am. I guess you women will be studying that name of God this week. A lot of claims that Jesus made about his unique relationship with God. He claimed to be the living, breathing manifestation of God. Let me show you one passage in particular, one incident in particular. Turn with me, please, to John chapter 14, verse 8. John chapter 14, verse 8. It's page 1068 in the Pew Bible. John 14. We're going to come back to this chapter and study it more when we talk about Jesus in more detail 3 weeks from now. But I wanted to show you this passage today, John 14, starting with verse 8. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it's enough for us. If we could just see God. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? This is the night of the Last Supper. Jesus has washed the feet of the disciples. He's instituted the ordinance of communion. He's talked about the importance of loving one another. And now he's telling his disciples that he's going back to his Father in heaven. Philip says, just show us God. That'd be enough for us. And Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That is an incredibly bold claim. Don't skip over that too fast. Imagine what people would say if I said, if you've seen me, you've seen the President. You'd laugh at that. If someone then says something far more dramatic than that, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, that is a bold claim. It says, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. Keep reading. Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. So Jesus is saying, if you want to know what God is like, study me. If you want to learn what God is like, study me. If you want to see God, look at me. Because I share the same essence of God. I am in the Father, he is in me. That's an important principle. If you want to learn what God is like, study the life of Jesus. Study the evidence in Jesus. That can be very helpful because for some people it's just too overwhelming to think about God as a whole. The concept is just too overwhelming. So start with Jesus. If you study the life of Jesus, you will understand what God is like. If you study the life of Jesus, you will see amazing love. You will see amazing purity. You will see amazing power. You will also see some surprising anger. You will see surprising mercy. You will see persistent joy. All those qualities and more, all those things and more, those are the qualities of God. The love, the purity, the power, the anger, the mercy, the joy, and more. All those qualities of his character, the character of Jesus, are also the character of God. If you want to understand what God is like, look at Jesus. You'll learn from him. The passage we read earlier this morning made the same point, John 1. Jesus is the Word of God, the full expression of God. He reveals to us in perfect form what God really is like. One more line of evidence to consider this morning, the evidence of personal experience. Evidence of personal experience. At some point, we need to move beyond just intellectual discussion and intellectual knowledge. We need to move beyond knowledge about God and begin a personal relationship with God. That's the ultimate experiential kind of evidence. That's what I mean by the evidence of personal experience. It's the internal evidence in your own heart. Earlier this morning, I Mentioned the analogy of love. Let me use the same analogy, but from a slightly different angle. How do you know when you found true love? How do you know when you found true love? Is it just the external evidence only? No. At some point, you just know. It's internal evidence of the heart. At some point, the internal evidence becomes more important. You just know. It's that internal evidence, personal evidence, and then hopefully you make a commitment to that person in marriage. That's the way it works. It's external evidence, but also the internal evidence. Something like that happens in the heart of a Christian. At some point, you just know. You just know. It's internal. You know that God is real. You know it's true because you have experienced Him personally in that relational sense. And you gladly commit yourself to Him forever. That's what it's like to be a Christian. Now, the Bible contains some stories of people who had dramatic personal experiences with God. Dramatic personal experiences with God. Think about Moses in the burning bush, or Elijah and the earthquake and then the still small voice afterwards. Or think about Isaiah and the vision of God in the temple. Or think about Saul, who later became Paul, and that blinding light, while he was on the road to Damascus. Those are dramatic personal experiences. God might reveal Himself to you in that way, but for most of us, frankly, including myself, it's not been that dramatic. It's not been that dramatic. It's quieter evidence, much quieter, but still just as real, still just as valid. At some point, you just know. You just know. For me, it started when I was a child, actually. My parents were Christians. They told me about God, and they told me about Jesus. And in a simple, childlike way, I just naturally believed what they told me. I actually prayed to God while I was still a preschooler and asked Him to forgive me and to save me. And I think that was a very simple, childlike commitment. As I grew older, I needed more evidence. I needed more information. But I still believed in the reality of God. And part of that belief was just very personal and subjective. You can't explain it fully. You just know. It's like God. You just know. For other people, the process is very different. Maybe they just never thought about God much at all. Their background is very different than mine. Maybe they just never thought about God very much at all. And then they go through a personal crisis of some sort. That's a common pattern also. And that crisis starts them on a spiritual search. It might be a long search, might be a short search, but eventually their understanding of God becomes very intimate. Maybe it starts out with the external things, but eventually becomes very internal. It's not just knowledge about God, it becomes knowledge of God. They just know. Other people, multiple different ways this happens, but other people, like one scientist I read about this week, John Sanford, they start out actually not believing in God. Not believing in God. Thank you, Gary, for the links. And he posted some links to that story of John Sanford. John Sanford was a scientist, a brilliant scientist apparently, studied the human genome, and actually his studies in the human genome eventually convinced him there must be God. This was just way too complicated for it to emerge by itself. He realized it. It took him a while, but he realized that. But he didn't stop with just learning facts about God. He didn't just stop with learning the facts that God must be an incredible designer. At some point, it became very personal for him also. He committed his life to God in faith. He asked to be forgiven and saved. He was convinced not just from science, but he was convinced from that personal experience that God was real. Again, he just knew. It was that the evidence of personal experience. The Bible refers to this experience as the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. God sends His Spirit into our spirits to bear witness that we are the children of God. Romans 8:16. It's a very personal, experiential knowledge. You just know. Now, as soon as I say that, I should add this. Personal experience can easily be deceptive. All sorts of crazy people have claimed personal experiences with God. That's why you need all the lines of evidence. You need the external lines of evidence in nature, and you need the external lines of evidence in the Bible, and you need the external lines of evidence in Jesus Christ Himself. But don't forget the personal, internal side too. It's all important. We need the whole picture so that we can have the full evidence of who God is. We need the whole picture so that we can have a reasonable, informed faith. True faith like true love, should be reasonable. But abstract ideas alone are not enough. You want to move into the area of true personal relationship. Now I know most of you have already come to that stage. Most of you have already come to a personal knowledge of God. If that's not true for you yet, I hope we can be of some help to you here at the church. That's why we're here. Help people learn about the grace of God, the reality of God. That's why we're here. I would be happy to talk to you in private if you have further questions, if you want to talk. My telephone number is listed there in the bulletin, or if you prefer email, it's real easy to remember, davisduggins@gmail.com. I'm not a pushy guy. You can look at me. I'm not a scary guy. You could probably ask any question you wanted, and I wouldn't be shocked, and I wouldn't be offended. You know, if you want to talk about these things in private, reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about these things in private. The evidence for God. Meanwhile, let me leave you with one challenge, just one challenge. If you're not sure about the existence of God, if you're not sure, I would encourage you to pray to God anyway. Pray honestly. I mean, don't fake something you don't really believe, but pray honestly. You could say, God, I don't know if you're real, but if you are, please show me. It could be a simple prayer like that. God, I don't really know if you're real, but if you are, please show me. Pray a simple prayer like that. You could pray it the first thing when you get up in the morning. You could pray it during the day if you have some downtime, a spare moment. You could pray it at night before you go to bed.